just another night in the Big Ten last night. You had a front row seat for Wisconsin and Purdue. Man, just an amazing evening with some great individual performances.
You know, I think we've been really fortunate here on Big Ten Network with Purdue because 3 of their games, I was at 2 of the 3, have really come down to the last few possessions and really been highly entertaining. Maybe 2 not so for Purdue, but that Iowa game earlier in the season without Keegan Murray ended up going, sort of later than I think Purdue wanted. Highly entertaining. Obviously, the Rutgers game was the best game we've seen on this network in quite some time. And then last night, we did not expect it. I think more than anything, Wisconsin, in a way, beat Purdue by being Purdue, because in the first half, they were going inside, right to Travion Williams and Zach Edey. They were 1 of 12 on threes, and yet they were beating Purdue by attacking the inside. And when I talked to Matt Painter coming onto the court, he was kind of surprised. He's like, they're coming right at us. They're not shooting the basketball well. Well, what flipped in the second half was Johnny Davis basically just took over.
He is our big story. Let's dive into Johnny Davis's performance. He scored fully half of Wisconsin's points last night, a career-high 37, as the Badgers did get that win at Mackey. Amazingly, it's just the 6th time in 46 all-time visits there that Wisconsin has won. They beat the Boilers 74-69, just their 3rd ever road win against an AP top 3 team. And I think we need to dive a little bit more into Davis. I mean, it's just a transcendent performance. And again, I think we're talking about a guy, and I hate to project ahead because I love enjoying players while they're here. This is going to be it. I mean,
yes.
He's gone. He's going to the NBA. But what he's done now is, to me, elevated the Wisconsin expectations dramatically. I mean, I think this felt like it was going to be a transition year. They had that veteran team last year. Brad Davison did come back, and I think his performance last night was really underrated. He came up with some huge plays down the stretch, but it's clearly going to be Davis's team. But now all of a sudden they go from a team that I think a lot of people thought was somewhere in the middle of the pack, maybe even the bottom middle of the pack, to a team that clearly can beat anybody, Andy.
Yeah, there's no question. I asked Greg and Johnny last night, Greg Gard, that, why not Wisconsin? Because certainly with Purdue being the overwhelming favorite early, now they've got 2 losses. Wisconsin has the 1 road loss at Ohio State. They legitimately can win the Big Ten because they've got, as you said, a transcendent player. What's amazing about Johnny Davis, and Matt Painter said this during shoot-around, he says this is the last time he's playing at Mackey Arena. And there's no talk of there being a bubble of them going back to Mackey Arena because Wisconsin beat North Carolina on that floor last March. But the fact is that he has taken himself from a marginal first-round kind of guy to being a lottery pick in as short amount of time as I can remember of a prospect. And by doing so, a lot of it has to do with USA Basketball this past summer. And I think that's an underrated thing in this pandemic world we're living in, that they sort of snuck that in, because in 2020 there was no USA Basketball. In 21, they played that tournament, and you had Jaden Ivey, Zach Edey, Caleb Houston, Caleb First, and Johnny Davis. And that tournament, making the team actually, gave him, and he told me this, confidence that I don't know if he would have had otherwise to really springboard into this season.
Well, I'd say he's got confidence. Wherever he got it, he clearly has it. I threw out this stat last night. I know you'll like this. He is the first player to lead his team in points, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks in a road win against a top 5 team since Tim Duncan in 1997.
I was watching. I heard you say it.
At Maryland. I mean, that's an amazing stat. It just shows you the incredible dominance of his performance and what a versatile player he is. And I think that's the thing that has stood out to me the most, right? I mean, he scored 37 points. He had 14 rebounds, right? And you think about the issues that their big guys had, and let's just be honest, they're not great inside.
No.
They're
serviceable.
They're serviceable, right? And it was clear what the game plan was they were going to try to play the Purdue bigs one-on-one. They weren't going to double down on Travion Williams and let him throw his passes to open three-point shooters. They were going to they were going to play him straight up and give those 15 fouls, and they gave all 15 of them, Andy.
Yeah, and the other thing about Davis is he's also one of those players that has now celebrated the big moment. And not everyone can do that. Not everyone can go from the second, third, fourth option, become the one option, and embrace it. Because there were big shots last night that he wanted to take and made. And I was racking my brain when I was driving back late last night. Who's the last Wisconsin player that could do this? And I'd like to hear from you. I don't know. I guess I'm thinking Devin Harris.
Devin Harris is the one I threw out this morning.
Because of a player that could just take the game over, get his own shot. This is the most points in a Wisconsin player, I think, since Frank Kaminsky went over 40. But Frank still needed the basketball. Sam Decker needed the basketball. And there's no question Johnny Davis can take it and go.
Sam Decker is an interesting one. Sam Decker was a really good one-on-one player.
But he never went off like this.
Right, no. And, of course,
Now, maybe he would have if he'd stayed.
Yeah, in a weird sort of way, he was a complimentary guy,
yes.
Right? I mean, that's what's so crazy about Sam Decker, as talented as he was. It was fabulous. And as good as they were offensively, and again, I thought Davison was really good. And he was coming off that terrible performance against Illinois State, although he had a couple plays down the stretch in that game, but certainly didn't shoot it well. But he hit that big three on the out-of-bounds play that was huge, and just played with confidence, had a couple big assists down the stretch. But put the offense aside, Purdue's the most efficient offense in the country. I thought what Wisconsin did on the defensive end, again, giving a ton of fouls in this game, but you think about the most efficient offense in the country in Purdue, and they reasonably held them in check. They held them about 18 points, I think it was, under their scoring average. A team that was shooting 52% on the year coming in shot 41%. I don't think you can underrate the performance there, because as good as they were on the offensive end, they were every bit as good defensively.
I agree with you 100%. I also would say that their blueprint now for other teams of basically being almost like the hack-a-shack kind of thing, because they really flustered, especially Zach Edey. There were times, obviously, it was a little Nerf basketball, when he gets it deep enough. But there were other times they just bodied him, fouled him, whatever,
right,
and really flustered him. And to some degree, Travion Williams as well, because they had multiple guys, all 15 fouls. I mean, Vogt ended up fouling out as well. But I think that's going to be something, if you've got the personnel, use them. And then the other thing, and I don't know if we're, the Purdue question, I still say, is late game ball management, ball security with their guards. As great as Jaden Ivey is, sometimes I think he tries to do too much, over-penetrates, and gets himself in trouble. And their guard play, I think, just has to be better if they're going to win the Big Ten and the national championship.
I do want to talk a little bit about Purdue before we move on to Keegan Murray's performance from last night, which was fabulous as well. But kind of what do you make of Purdue at this point? I mean, here's a team that's number 3 in the nation. They're 1-2 in the league. They obviously won't be number 3 in the nation when the next poll comes out. I thought Matt Painter's comments after the game were really telling last night, where he said, I've been telling you guys we're not a very good defensive team, and everyone says it's just coach speak. He said, I want to be perfectly clear. We're not a very good defensive team. And honestly, you watched them last night, and they weren't a very good defensive team.
Well, one thing that I also observed at shoot-around and then during the game was, for whatever reason, and this happened against NC State, I think it happened against Iowa, and to some degree Rutgers, they just take a while to get going. And I don't know if they expect to be up by 10 or something like that. I mean, if you remember during that game last night, there was a point where Sasha Stefanovic had to get everyone going. Like, I know the paint crew wasn't there, but it was a packed house. And they've got great fans. I don't want to disparage the fans anyway, but even just for his team, like he had, let's go, come on. And it just felt flat. And this league is too good. You cannot be flat against pretty much anyone in this league, as we saw the other night. Indiana loses at Penn State. Ohio State almost loses to Nebraska. You cannot be flat, especially at the beginning. You can't dig yourself a hole. And they gave Wisconsin too many chances to just hang around. Even when they took that mini lead at one point, Wisconsin came right back and responded. And there's no question, Wisconsin was the grittier team last night, which I did not think I would say in a Wisconsin-Purdue matchup.
We talked about on the big show last night, practice is going to be challenging, I would say, this week at Purdue. I do want to move on, because Davis wasn't the only player who went off last night. Again, Keegan Murray was just phenomenal. He's the nation's leading scorer. He tied his career high with 35 as the Hawks held off Maryland 80-75. As you can see, it was his second game of 35 points this season, tied for the 4th most points for a Big Ten player in a game this year, behind Davis, Trace Jackson Davis, Kofi Cockburn. Amazingly, 3 of the top 6 scoring performances of the Big Ten this year have occurred the last 2 nights. Malachi Branham, of course, on that list as well. And look, this wasn't quite as momentous a win as a home win for Iowa against Maryland. You would expect Iowa probably to win this game at home, although I thought Maryland gave a game effort. But it doesn't in any way take away from what a special player Keegan Murray is. He was just incredible last night.
I would disagree just a tiny bit with you. I thought this was a pick'em. I don't know what the line was, but I didn't expect Iowa to win because Iowa, outside of the Virginia win, had not basically met the moment.
That's fair. Yeah.
You know, to this point, they had not met the moment of playing a peer-to-peer team and beating them home, road, outside of Virginia, and having Keegan Murray play like he did last night. To me, that was the game. That crossed the threshold. Okay, he's elite. Let's embrace him as one of the best players in the country. I'm not saying he wasn't before, but he was putting up great numbers against lesser competition. He came to play last night. He served notice to the rest of the league, like, I don't care who you are, what it says on the front. I'm one of the best players in the league.
He is such a tough matchup, too, because he is such a big-bodied guy. So he can beat you inside, but he can handle the ball. He can beat you outside. I mean, he is who we were talking last night, like, who do you put on him? How do you guard him? I mean, he really is. He's kind of a matchup nightmare. And it's amazing that you had such a special player in Luka Garza, and he leaves, and then a year later, you've got another incredibly special player. I mean, this just doesn't happen. You don't have players like that back-to-back, different guys.
True, and I would say that what we're spoiled at this season is the fact that we've got two of them, because Johnny Davis and Keegan Murray were not primary options as freshmen. There was no guarantee they would do this as sophomores, and they both have, and they've become All-Americans.
There were some people who might have even doubted, you know, are they even a top 20 player in the league? That's the last time I'll say it. You just set up. You put it on the tee.
I know.
Put it there. I had to put it down the middle of the fairway.
We wanted to see it.
Yeah,
we saw it. I went Davis and Bohannon, and I was party to the Super Senior.
Quick takeaway on Maryland. I actually thought, and you know, I buy what you were saying. I thought Iowa would win the game, but I think Maryland showed a lot last night. They dug an early 12-point hole. I thought they showed great balance. All five of their starters scored in double figures. They're clearly going to be gritty and tough. They just came up against a player they couldn't stop.
Yeah, I'll just say this quickly. I mean, this is not to knock Mark Turgeon. I do think there's a renewed energy with this group under Danny Manning. Different voice. I saw it in person in Brooklyn a couple weeks ago. They're going to beat people at home.
No doubt.
They may steal a road win or two. They are not an NCAA tournament team as we sit here in January. I'm not saying they can't be. Could be a solid NIT team, but they're going to be a problem in this league.
It's interesting. You look at the statistical ratings of them. I mean, the net hates Maryland right now. KenPom really likes Maryland. I mean, you know, KenPom looks at Maryland as a team that might be in that mix. So we shall see. But I don't think it's totally out of the question. They can figure it out.
Yes.
Got some guys who can score that backcourt in particular. Big Ten bowl season over one game before we hoped it might be, but there was still a ton to like from this year. 6 bowl victories, tied for the second most in conference history. Michigan, of course, the biggest story, the first ever CFP, ended its longest conference title drought in history. In all, 7 Big Ten teams finished with 9 or more wins. That is an all-time record. How about that? Anthony Herron is here. How about that? I mean, that's the real news, that Anthony is here. So what do you make of it? I mean, again, look, I think in this day and age, you are measured by whether or not you win a national championship fairly or unfairly. And, of course, the league falls short on that measure. But, man, there's so many other things to like. So kind of how do you put it together and distill it down to a conclusion?
Well, I think overall, when you see the depth of the conference that was on display, not just during the regular season, like, you know, the non-conference slate coming into conference play, and then in conference play, you still did have some excellence that sort of separated itself from the rest of the conference. So I think all that pieced itself together in a way where we saw approaching bowl season that the Big Ten had what was their strongest teams, their sort of best hopes, and the very best hope that won the conference didn't include Ohio State. So, you know, just in a vacuum this season, having Michigan not actually make it to the championship game, they still reached the college football playoff. So you didn't end up reaching that pinnacle goal, but just overall sort of the life of the conference as a whole. You're seeing depth in the Big Ten. I don't think anyone anticipates that Penn State won't have more sustainability in seasons moving forward than what showed itself this year. So you got some of the top brands at the top end of the conference, and we're seeing, the West Division not recruiting at the level the East Division is, but teams like Indiana and Minnesota who are putting, some nice classes on top of each other. So it feels like when you're looking at all the data that's associated with it, the conference is getting stronger each year.
Yeah, it feels that way too. I always think of it in terms of like the satisfaction index, right? I mean, how many Big Ten fans are satisfied with kind of broadly where their program is? I think it's a pretty high number right now that would say, yeah, I think we're kind of heading in the right direction based on.
And there's somewhere that standard is going to continue raising, right? Like Michigan State,
absolutely.
Maryland, and Purdue. Like a standard's going to
no doubt.
keep
I
climbing.
think Rutgers would be on that
Right.
list as well, and yeah, no question. So I think kind of globally, broadly, league's in a good spot, really well coached, all those kinds of things, and as you say, recruiting on an uptick. Let's get into some of the specifics, and we start with Michigan, and it's such a weird year because on one hand, I mean, man, they put a lot of demons aside here, right? I mean, they got some monkeys off their back. You win the Big Ten championship. They had the longest title drought, as we know, in school history. They beat Ohio State. They had lost to them, hadn't beaten them in 10 years. I mean, all those kinds of things. Make the CFP for the first time ever. And yet the performance in the CFP was lacking, to say the least.
Right.
So how do you kind of put it all into perspective? By the way, David Ojabo announcing today he's going pro. I think that's probably fully expected news.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
What do you make of where Michigan ended up?
It feels to me like a game. I mean, I talked about it quite a bit going into that matchup with Georgia, what I anticipated Michigan would do for their attack. And while, the line of scrimmage was certainly a strength for both teams going into it, I did feel like the definitive strength for Georgia's defense was on the interior of their defensive line. I just thought that Jim Harbaugh, Josh Gattis offensively would have time to just evaluate what their offensive attack should be. And I don't think they, certainly not early enough in the game, attempted to attack Georgia's defense in the way that they could, the exterior of the defensive front with the run game. And that secondary, which, it's not the worst secondary in college football that Georgia has, but if there's any level of their defense that can be had, it has throughout the season proven to be the defensive backs. And they didn't deploy that game plan during the game. And so, I think, Georgia's linebackers are special. Their defensive interior is special. Most of the other spots on the team where I think the discussion about personnel and speed, and there were certainly spots where Georgia had an advantage, I don't think we would view it through the same context if there wasn't just the one time in the first half that Roman Wilson went flying behind the defense and he was throwing the football. Michigan's receivers, to me, had a definitive advantage over Georgia's secondary going into that game. I just didn't see Michigan's offense attempt to exploit that. And I don't think Stetson Bennett is some vastly more talented quarterback or more capable quarterback than Cade McNamara. Frankly, I think Cade McNamara played really well in the game. Michigan's offense seemed kind of tight around him. And then certainly in the second half, as the game's out of hand, he threw another interception. But I thought Cade McNamara was throwing the ball really well. They just didn't necessarily give him many vertical opportunities. And I do think it's a game where Georgia's certainly shown themselves to be the better team. It should have, in my opinion, I think Jim Harbaugh and Josh Gattis probably come out of that game evaluating the film feeling like, man, we could have taken a more aggressive approach.
Yeah, it's interesting because it became apparent in, we were there and just in watching the line of scrimmage early on that on both ends, Georgia was just significantly better, both sides of the ball. And you think about Michigan, I mean, they are kind of a run-first team. I mean, I think that's who they want to be. It's who they were in the season, right? I mean, they kind of established a run throughout entire games early on in the year before we finally figured out they could throw the ball on 88 rushing yards. I mean, I think it was apparent that wasn't going to work. And then, of course, you've dug such a hole.
I wish they knew that going in. Well, and I'm sure they did going in. It didn't feel like the game plan actually stuck to that going forward. And I think there's going to be an offseason here for Michigan to sort of assess because most of the receiver talent is going to be returning. And they got some, I don't look at Andrell Anthony and say he's not better than that secondary. And, Andrell Anthony is an interesting story because we don't know why we didn't see more of him this season anyway. But Cornelius Johnson and A.J. Henning, they have guys who can fly.
No doubt.
At receiver. I already mentioned Roman Wilson. They got playmakers there. There's depth in that room for Michigan that I believe needs to be a bigger part of their offense, can make their offense more consistently combustible next year. And then we're talking, in my opinion, I think there's a national championship formula that's there. We'll see what the front seven on defense ends up being. There's questions that have to be answered there. But I think offensively, this can be a scary offense that Michigan puts on the field next year.
No doubt. I mean, you lose those bookends at defensive end. And of course, when people talk about kind of what made Michigan so special this year, that was a huge part of it. That you had two great rush ends that everyone had to account for. Now, Georgia did a great job of completely negating those guys and taking them out of the game. And the one thing that really impressed me afterward was to hear Kirby Smart talk about it, and Stetson Bennett to a certain extent too, that a lot of that was at the line of scrimmage, that was Stetson Bennett kind of understanding that, hey, they're loading the box on us and I'm just going to get rid of the ball quickly and get it out where we feel we have an advantage on the flank. So give some credit to him. I thought he played really well. What about Ohio State? A crazy win in the Rose Bowl. I mean, it's going to be one of the games where you kind of talk about it for years and you say, man, that was just so much fun to watch. I don't want to say it was a coming out party for Jackson Smith and Jigba because he had an unbelievable
He was their leading receiver.
But I think like for the rest of the country, for those who don't watch Ohio State every week and maybe didn't know.
They didn't see him against Rutgers probably.
They just kind of, they know that Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson are kind of NFL guys and they have this other guy who actually statistically maybe had a better year. But then you see him and you see how good he is. And obviously Stroud was unbelievable. I mean, it was a really memorable game. And I also thought just kind of to not take the lead until the final 5 minutes of the game, in a game where there was some question as to how much they really wanted to play in it, and yet to have the resilience to come back and win it, I thought it kind of spoke volumes about the character of that team.
And C.J. Stroud himself, like Jay has said, was special on that night. But what really got the Buckeyes started, like I was talking about how I thought Cade McNamara looked really engaged in the Orange Bowl to me. And I didn't see the offense around him kind of pick up what he was trying to put down. But C.J. Stroud, the first down Ohio State got on offense was on a 10-yard run where he had to lower his shoulder, barrel through a couple of tacklers. And how much this season we heard the Buckeye fans talking about wanting to see Stroud take off and run more frequently. And their offense was sputtering through the first couple of series. Stroud takes off and runs for a first down, gets up with a little bravado, and then the offense starts to do their thing. And I love that Ryan Day didn't completely get away from the run. Trayvon Henderson got plenty of touches. Utah's defensive front is probably the best D-line that Ohio State faced the entire season. They controlled the Buckeye rushing attack, but C.J. Stroud just as a leader, just as a dude on the field and just exuding confidence and kind of exhorting his teammates, whether verbally or just sort of intangibly, to ride with him, and they did. I really thought as much as anything, and Stroud was a Heisman finalist, but just as the man for that program, I really thought he sort of set himself on a new plateau there.
To do that against a Utah defense, I mean, that's what Kyle Whittingham's known for, right?
Exactly.
Having really good, tough physical defenses. And I mean, Ohio State averaged more than 10 yards of play. But it's just, you average a first down every time you snap the ball. It's
not bad.
It's pretty good. There were some issues on defense, and they're going to address those for sure. And
they're going to need to.
I said this yesterday. Jim Knowles has a work cut out for him. I mean, he definitely has some work to do, but I thought the second half was impressive, and it's all
people like touchdowns. So it was a really fun first half, like with the defense optional there.
It's all that much more impressive when you consider the opt-outs, and of course, opt-outs are the reality now in college football. They were far from the only ones, Ohio State, who experienced that. You see plenty of big names choosing not to play in their bowls. Everyone from the Walter Camp National Player of the Year, Kenneth Walker III, to Purdue's top players on both sides of the ball, David Bell, George Karlaftis. There's been a lot of talk about opt-outs, some heavily scrutinized comments from Kirk Herbstreit, Desmond Howard over the weekend. Nicole and I talked about this at length yesterday, so I certainly gave my piece. So those who are watching the show for the second day in a row, I'm not going to get into it to the extent that I did. But I want you, I know it, look, it's kind of on the forefront of everyone's mind. Anyone who's a football analyst who talks about the game, who played the game as you did. So I'm interested to hear your take.
I mean, I'm a guy who I certainly consider myself of old school sensibilities. Like I played college football 20 years ago. When I did, I went through a coaching change at Iowa, never considered transferring, though some of my teammates did. It never crossed my mind to get paid to play the game of college football. That wasn't necessarily at the front of our minds at that point in the late 90s. And then just as the sport has evolved over the years, my evaluation of where the players are at, just like mentally and their engagement with the game, I don't think the players have changed at all. I don't question the love of George Karlaftis, one of the most driven competitors we've seen of recent Big Ten vintage, or either the Bosa brothers or anyone else who's made a decision that, their risk-reward sort of analysis, the cost-benefit analysis of that risk of a bowl would have them sit out a game. That doesn't make me think anyone's making the improper decision for playing in one of these bowl games either. I don't think the players are different. I think the surrounding environment is different that we're seeing these athletes competing in. We see coaches exercising all types of freedom. We see institutions and conferences exercising all types of freedom. The bowl system is watered down in a way that it's never been before. Like, there were 20 bowl games when I played college football 20 years ago. Now there's 44 bowl games. Like, 2/3 of the teams who play FBS football get to play in a bowl. And so all these things around the players are different, and yet we're still like romanticizing what we expect from the players while not recognizing that, because like virtually every discussion leads with talking playoff, and we're expecting the players should behave in the exact same manner that they did years ago, when the entire environment that they're competing in is vastly different than it's ever been before, and we continue to ask more of them. We're adding regular season games. Everyone's playing conference championship games. We have all these additional bowl games, and oh, by the way, we're talking about expanding the playoff, and that's going to be worth billions of additional dollars as well, but we're just looking at the players like, hey, maybe you should just do the exact same thing you've always been doing. It's nonsensical to me for us to think everything around the athletes can adjust, but the athletes should be the exact same, like have their aptitude, their attitude about it be the exact same as it's always been historically. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And I think, what I said yesterday is I just think it comes down to each individual. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. There's a right or wrong answer for each person.
Right.
And, it was interesting in talking to Jake Butt. He joined us on the set when we were down at the Orange Bowl, and he, of course, is held up as Exhibit A by a lot of people, and yet he says...
Butt, Jalen Smith.
Yeah, and he says, I'd do it all over again. It was absolutely the right choice for me.
It was fun watching Tyler Linderbaum versus Marquand McCall. That's a big nose tackle for Kentucky. They're getting it on. Linderbaum leaves briefly with an injury, comes back in.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I think that's great that he made that choice.
Right.
I don't question Tyler Goodson, the other Tyler on Iowa, who didn't play in the game. The dude loves football. He decided not to play in the Citrus Bowl.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it just comes down to each individual. And for people not to understand that, and you're right. I mean, there's so much going on now that's different. There is no doubt that the narrative of the playoff and that the whole season is oriented around whether or not you make the playoff. And then for players to understand, this was one of the arguments against the playoff for years, was what it would do to the other bowl games. And it hasn't. That doesn't mean that they're not significant to those who play in them.
We still both really enjoyed watching the Rose Bowl.
Right? Like, I love them. And here's what I will say. Like, you look at the television ratings, people still watch in amazing numbers. They watch games that they would never think of watching.
Tens of millions of people
during the regular season. I mean,
man.
Put the Rose Bowl aside. People watch the Rose Bowl no matter what. But, I mean, some of these games on December 22nd, between, teams, I don't want to disparage any conference, but two mid-major leagues where you couldn't name a single player on either of the teams, and millions of people watch.
Yeah.
Right? People still want to watch.
I'm proud. I'll say I'm proud. As a former player, I'm proud of the additional agency that I see the current player grabbing and making informed decisions for themselves. Every decision is not one size fits all. I'm completely fine with that. I'm proud of the way they're handling things.
100%. Final look at the overall records in the Big Ten. 4 teams finishing with double-digit win totals. I mentioned 7 with 9 or more wins, 9 teams with winning records. Lots of particularly some of the teams that surprised a bit. Michigan, of course, at the top of the list, but Michigan State, Purdue, among others. Speaking of the Boilers, here's what Coach Jeff Brom had to say after the thrilling win in the Music City Bowl. Quote, give everything you got with no let-up, and this team just did that. Proud of our players and coaches on a 9-win season and a Music City Bowl victory. A huge thank you to the fans for showing up all year. Special time to be a Boilermaker. And how about them Boilers? That's always his tagline in the post-game celebrations. You
want to put a little draw on it? How about them Boilers?
No doubt. Look, this was an unbelievable game.
Yeah.
Their most wins since 2003. And again, if the narrative is like bowl games don't matter, like that one mattered to the guys who played. And again, you can say, well, David Bell, George Karlaftis didn't play. The guys who did play were totally invested in it. It was meaningful to Purdue. What did you take away from Purdue and really a bounce-back season?
And I mean, multiple other receivers out as well. You know, no Milton Wright out there in the game for them
Brock
as
Thompson
well.
could hardly walk.
Brock Thompson was limping around everywhere, man. I thought they were going to go and lop one of his legs off in the middle of the field. And then here he comes again, catching another deep ball. And I just think that what we saw from Aiden O'Connell was special, responding from interceptions. And what we saw from that receiver corps, just battling through. Jackson Anthrop playing running back and slot and lining up on the outside. And that defense without George Karlaftis sort of attracting so much of the attention from the opposing offensive line and pass protection, just kind of battling through and finding a way. Yes, they were exhausted by the time you got into the fourth quarter and no one was able to play defense. Both offenses were obviously stellar going in. And that was a road game for Purdue, man. I lived in Tennessee for a couple of years. I know the Rocky Top crowd, they will travel. They got no issue getting from Knoxville to Nashville. And it was a crowd that was getting after the Boilermakers. And in the end, the Purdue fans that were there showed themselves up in the fourth quarter. And that football team to do that in that environment. And I got to say this again, because I've been sort of revisiting this throughout the season. I talked before the year on Big Ten Radio about just Jeff Brom, the difficulty of his non-conference schedules that he goes with consistently. And he doesn't set himself up to make bowls every year. But his team responded with 8 regular season wins, tough non-conference, tough crossovers for Purdue. That is a magnificent year for the Boilermakers and a great way to culminate it.
And it just shows that a fan base can enjoy a season that does not include winning a division or going to the CFP. That you can say, you know what?
Exactly.
There weren't a lot of expectations heaped on our team.
Music City Bowl was a grand old time, man.
No doubt. We've got some really good players to feel good about in the future. I just thought it was Exhibit A of why we can love college football in this college football playoff environment for a team that had nothing to do. They never had a chance to make the college football playoff.
Without their 2 best players, Bell Karlaftis, they went, made their decision. That's cool. The other team fought their tails off, and that was magnificent in itself.
What about Iowa? It fell short in the bowl game. I still think it was a really positive season. I mean, you win the West. There are certainly going to be questions going forward about the offense and the quarterback spot. What do you take away from it all?
I think Iowa is a squad that I suppose I'm starting to view them in a similar lens with Wisconsin, where I'm wondering, okay, so where do you take the next step? How do you go about taking the next step? For the Badgers, they got back to this season sort of just playing bully ball after trying to figure out early in the year if Graham Mertz could take their passing attack to another level. That wasn't working, so they said, all right, we got Braylon Allen, man, let's ride with this O-line and this domineering running back. I wonder for Iowa this offseason, obviously the offensive line will have to get back to that Hawkeye standard, but then in addition to that, how do you grow with the throw game? Whether that is, it sounds like it's going to be Spencer Petras or Alex Padilla or, the practice squad MVP that was there for them throughout the year. But Iowa's passing attack needs to get better, not to make a bowl game. We know they're going to do that every year with Kirk Ferentz, perhaps not even to be a double-digit win team like they were this year, but can they go beyond that? Not just making the Big Ten championship game, but what kind of threat can you be more so? How do you develop? They've got to develop the passing attack.
And I know there are questions about the offensive scheme and whatnot, but can I just say that the touchdown pass to Sam Laporta was about as beautifully designed a play as I have ever seen. And it was like, as it's starting, you're like,
this has got a chance. Look at Laporta go to the tight end, man.
Oh, man, that was really something. And I thought the run game showed some signs in that game. Gavin Williams?
Impressive.
Yeah.
He's a thumper. He's a young thumper that they have in the backfield. O-line overall, get back to that Hawkeye standard where you're really opening these gaping holes. That needs to be the expectation.
Almost certainly will be without Linderbaum next year. But, and again, the O-line has not this year been where you would expect it to be, particularly given that you have the best center in the country. But we'll see. Penn State kind of limped to the finish. They started 5-0. They lost 6 of their last 8. Quick takeaway on the Nittany Lions.
It's about the run game, and they've got some talent coming in there. They've got one of the top, maybe in some publications, the top quarterback in the country coming in Drew Aller. So he'll likely back up Sean Clifford. And then they have more talented running backs. A lot of publications saying that Nicholas is going to be the top running back in the country. But they're already talented in the backfield. It's got to start up front on the offensive line for Penn State. They're going to replenish talent in the front 7 on defense because that's just what they do. A lot of the back end returns with some of the NFL talent that's back there. So I expect the defense to continue to perform like a Penn State D. That offensive line, though, they've got to get beefier and more domineering with the way that they can just impose on each phase.
I cannot get over this stat, and I've said it a few times. I'm going to say it one last time, although I'm sure I'll say it in the preseason next year, too. Longest touchdown run of the year, 7 yards.
It's not very far. Certainly not by Penn State standards.
Penn State,
Yeah,
right?
man.
So no, they'll figure it out, right?
I think
Penn
so.
State football,
so.
James
Yeah.
Franklin,
That's what
know what
they
they're
do.
doing.